Well, here in Esther chapter 9, we're going to see as these two edicts that we've been talking about these last couple chapters come to the day, 13th day of Adar. So the 12th month, 13th day, what's going to happen? There's an edict that was released before by Haman that the Jews should be executed on this day. And then there was another edict that was put out later by Mordecai that said that if you attack the Jews, they have fair game to attack and destroy you as well. So now we get to the time when this is going to happen, and that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter today. So now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes in Greek, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and lieutenants and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out through all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And Parshathdanah and Dalphon and Aspatha and Portha and Adela, these are the names, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they, but on the spoil laid they not their hand. So they killed his sons, but they left his wealth alone, probably because of his wife. So they left her alone with the possession so she could live, basically. Most likely is why. But verse 11, on that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace. And the 10 sons of Haman, what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee, or what is thy request further? And it shall be done. Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. So they killed his sons again, but they didn't take the spoils of his property. He still had a wife. His wife wasn't killed, so that's probably for her to live on. Verse 16, but the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. So there were still quite a few people that tried to put this edict into place, and the Jews fought against him, and the Jews were successful at winning. Verse 17, on the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made a day of feasting and gladness. So the 13th, they had this big battle because of these two edicts. The Jews ended up winning it in the long run, so the 14th day, the next day they rested, and they ended up celebrating a feast of victory over this. So verse 18, but the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested and made it a day of feast and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. So they're giving gifts of food and drink to each other, things they can consume that day as well to help each other out. Verse 20, and Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. Because Haman the sons of Hammedatha and the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur, or casting lots. Purim is the plural. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to the writing, and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. So they sent this out saying, this is the feast we'll do every year, basically. It says here in verse 29, then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. So this is the second letter saying, yes, this is the edict of the queen as well. This is all coming out. This is right. Verse 30, and he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So this is a feast now that they have put in place to commemorate the Jews being freed from this destruction that they had coming at them. Now, you might ask yourself, do they do this today? Is this still around? Does the Jewish nation still do this? The answer is yes. They actually do still do this. It's not as widely utilized everywhere, but from what I understand, in the city of Jerusalem, they do this, and some of the outskirting areas they do this feast still. I don't think they do it much in America or other places outside of the nation of Israel, but in the nation of Israel, some synagogues do follow this, and they still follow this feast. So we can see still, even to this day, we do it. In fact, the day of Purim in 2023, which is when most of these videos were shot, was March 7th. So that's the date of when they did it this time. That was the 13th day of Adar, or the 12th month for them in 2023. So Herman Wouk, in his book, This Is My God, wrote actually what happens on this day of Purim. So I want to read this to you to give you an example of what they still do on this day in Israel. Purim is the nearest thing Judaism has to a carnival, he says. It is another full moon celebration falling on the 14th of Adar, usually in February or March. The origin of the holy day is in the Book of Esther. The occasion is, of course, the famous deliverance of the Persian Jews from their Hitler-like oppressor, Haman. The day before Purim is the Fast of Esther, a sunrise-to-sundown abstention. At sundown, the synagogues fill up. The marked difference between this and all other occasions of the Jews' year is the number of children on hand. Purim is children's night in the house of the Lord. It always has been, and the children sense their rights and exercise them. They carry flags and noisemakers, the traditional whirling rattles called groggers, which can make a staggering racket. After the evening prayers, the reading of the Book of Esther begins, solemnly enough, with the customary blessing over a scroll and the chanting of the opening verses in a special musical mode heard only on this holiday. The children are poised, waiting. The reader chants through the first and second chapters and comes at last to the long-awaited sentence, "After these things the king raised to power Haman the Agagite." But nobody hears the last two words. The name Haman triggers off stamping, pounding, and a hurricane of groggers. The reader waits patiently. The din dies. He chants on, and soon strikes another Haman. Bedlam breaks loose again. This continues, and since Haman is now a chief figure in the story, the noisy outbursts come pretty frequently. The children, far from getting tired or bored, warm to the work. They do it with sure mob instinct. Poised silence during the reading, explosions on each Haman. Passages occur where Haman's name crops up in several times in a very short space. The children's assaults come like pistol shots. The reader's patience wears thin and finally breaks. It is impossible to read with so many interruptions. He gestures angrily at the children through the grogger storm and shoots a glance of appeal to the rabbi. This, of course, is what the children have been waiting for. The stag is down. Thereafter, to the end, it is a merciless battle between the reader and the children. He tries to slur over the thick-falling Hamans. They trip him every time with raucous salvos. He stumbles onto the final verse, exhausted, beaten, furious, and all is disordered hilarity in the synagogue. It is perhaps not quite fair to make the reader stand in for Haman on this evening, but that is approximately what happens. Beyond this gaiety, it carries 4 religious obligations: to hear the Megillah, or the Scroll of Esther, read, to distribute largesse to the poor, to make a feast, and to exchange presents with neighbors and friends. This last institution is shalach manos, the sending of gifts, things that can be eaten and drunk the same day. So this is the Feast of Purim, connected with like the Feast of Esther, basically, and put together. I think we're starting to understand why the Book of Esther was kept in the Jewish scriptures, because of the importance to them that she brings. Not only in saving them, she is key in saving them. She saves the nation from being destroyed. And definitely a story worthy of having in the history books for us to read and understand. So this is why we have the Book of Esther in here for us as well. Because if you think about it, without Esther, if the Jews were killed, there's no line of David and no Savior. There's a lot of importance behind what she does. And it's so wonderful that she does this. So let's jump over to the final chapter of the Book of Esther, chapter 10, and we'll see you then.